back. Hey, Mr. Pond Boss, tell me what to do to make all my Lunker Lake dreams come true.
Hello everybody, Bob Lusk, the Pond Boss, coming at you live from right here on the shores of the Brazos River, Pecan Plantation, Texas. Been thinking about what to talk about today, and I thought, you know what, this would be a good day to talk about some of the myths about largemouth bass. So I'm going to kind of tackle that subject. But first I wanted to just kind of throw out my personal condolences to Ray Scott's family. We lost Ray. Ray passed away Sunday night at 11:30 peacefully at his house and with his family around him. And I've known Ray a long time. And I thought I might start off by talking about some stories with Ray. So now, let me see if I can get this to where I can see comments here. I see Drew Schmidt, Doug Cusick. Let's see here, my little thing is moving around here. Let's see what's going on here. Dennis Smith. Okay. So, here we go. I think I'll start off by talking. There's Chuck Anzalone, but from down south Louisiana. I'm going to start off by telling a couple of Ray Scott stories. And you know, for those of you that don't know Ray, hi Dennis. Ray is the founder of BASS. He started it way back in 1967, and it was really interesting. He told me the story himself. He said he was an insurance salesman back then, and he took a little trip off over to, oh gosh, I can't think of the lake near Jackson, Ross Barnett Reservoir over near Jackson, Mississippi, with one of his buddies. Well, it was in March of that year, which probably was 1965, 66, through there somewhere, and they got rained off the lake. So they went back to the motel and they started watching TV, and basketball was on. So they were watching about basketball teams, college NCAA tournaments, and having a big time. And Ray was telling me the story. He said, you know, I had a brainstorm and a rainstorm. He said, I got to thinking if these college teams can have tournaments playing basketball, well, why can't we have tournaments playing or going fishing for bass? So that's how it started. So he started kind of thinking about it. Created a little organization and kind of started putting it together. Didn't have a whole lot of money to do it. And his very first tournament in 1967, I believe, was at Beaver Lake, Arkansas. And he needed 100 anglers to break even. And they were all going to pay like $100 or something like that. And he borrowed money from a local physician there in Springdale, Arkansas, to help fund it. And the physician said, okay, you know what, I'm going to loan you this money, and you put this tournament together. I'd like to fish in it, but if it doesn't pay back, just don't tell my wife. Well, Ray was able to make enough money off of it to pay his loan off, and then shortly after that, he came up with BASS, and that was, the name actually came up, was derived from an outdoor rider from Tulsa, Oklahoma. So I am not seeing the comments here, and I don't know why. Oh, here they are. Now I'm seeing it. Now I see it. I see it. Doug Cusick. You know how Doug's got the game going on here. Hashtag Pond Boss Magazine. Click like or the little heart icon. Share this to your timeline. You're eligible for a Pond Boss hat and something else, whatever Leanne says. And you guys know the drill. Here's a copy of Pond Boss Magazine. $35 a year. You guys, if you haven't subscribed to Pond Boss yet, I would encourage you to do that. I see Trey Carpenter, Danny Mack, Mike Cottrell, Mike Cook. I wasn't seeing the comments there because I had the wrong little box clicked. Now I'm seeing everybody. Cool. So anyway, Ray told me that story. I got to spend a lot of time with Ray, and I tell you how I met him. The very first time I saw him in person was on Lake Bastrop in Texas. Lake Bastrop had started getting choked with hydrilla. And the Lower Colorado River Authority, that was a lake that they used as a cooling lake for a power plant to generate electricity for the city of Austin and the surrounding communities. Well, they wanted to come in and treat that hydrilla and knock it back because it was fouling the intake for the power plant. They were going to have to shut the power plant down. Well, the bass fishermen got up in arms, and then one of them sent a letter to Ray, and Ray called the governor of Texas, George Bush back then, and they brought over a weed cutter boat. And I remember it had 2 flagpoles on it. So it's this boat with like a sickle mower underneath. So it would cut that hydrilla and it would bring it up on the deck, funnel it to a conveyor, and send it down the conveyor, chop it up, and then send it back in the lake. So there were TV stations from Houston, Austin, Bryan College Station, San Antonio down there, and newspaper reporters. And I got invited to tag along with Mark McDonald, who was the editor, founder of Pond Boss Magazine back then. So I got to go watch this thing and listen to Ray had on he was notorious for a cowboy hat and a fringed leather vest, which he wore that a lot. And so I'll always remember him talking about how the bass anglers were going to have a say and how the lake was treated and all that. But what he didn't tell him, because he didn't know, is that hydrilla, you cut it 6 feet deep with a weed cutter, then you convey it up onto a boat, and then chop it up and send it back in the lake. It reproduces by fragmentation. It grows 6 inches a day. So if you cut it 6 feet deep, 12 days later, it was back at the surface, and now you've spread it all over the lake by sending fragments with the currents and waves. So there was a lot of things that people didn't know about aquatic plants like hydrilla back then, and that was my first impression of Ray Scott. So we fast forward a couple of years, and he's at a fishing show in Mesquite, Texas. Now, the guy that owned the show, Carroll Ferries was his name. Carroll had called me and said, hey, can you get me a few 1 to 2 pound bass that I can put into a tank for anglers to climb up there and fish and throw lures in it and show people how the lures work? And I said, yeah, I could probably do that. He said, how much are they? I told him. He said, well, can I rent them? And I said, well, sure, you can rent the fish. I'll take them, do something with them when we're done. He said, how much is the rent? And I said, well, what do you want to do? He said, how about if I just give you a booth? So I took a booth for Pond Boss Magazine. And, of course, I was, at that time, full-blown into pond management and doing all that kind of stuff. And hey, Chuck Brinkman, good to see you. John Dyer, good to see you. James Allen, good to see James from Kentucky. See who else we got here. Dustin Russell, good to see Dustin. Steve Scanlon, good to see Steve. Jason Cater. Who else we got? David Kent. Good deal. Good to see all you guys. Sweet. So anyway, Ray was doing a personal appearance at that show. And I'd never been able to meet him. This is probably 96 or 97 through there somewhere. And I got to go up to him. Hey, Michael Eric, good to see you. How's everything in Iowa? Reed Coleman is watching. Good to see Reed. So he was selling his book, Bass Boss. And I knew that book was on the market, and it kind of struck me a little bit. How did he come up with that name? Did he get that name from Pond Boss? And I asked him later, where'd you get that name for that book? He said, Pond Boss. Well, I think he's probably jerking my chain, but it pulled the chain, which was pretty fun. There's James Allen, yep, from Kentucky. So anyway, his book was for sale, and it was $20. Well, I had come out with the Raising Trophy Bass book, I think it was, back about that time. And it was fresh out. So this had to be like 1999, I guess, because that's about the time I put that book out. So anyway, I went up to him, I stood in line. There was a line of people. And I had a $20 bill in my pocket. He had a little sign on the table that said, Bass Boss, $20. So he was talking to everybody in the line. He was so jovial and easy to talk to, such an iconic guy. Well, anyway, it got my turn. I walked up there, and he said, do you want to buy one of my books? I said, yes, sir, I do. He said, it'd be $20. So I gave him a $20 bill. And he said, you want me to sign it? I said, yes, sir, please do. So he said, what's your name? I said, I'm Bob Lusk. He lays his pen down. He says, the Pond Boss? I said, oh, my gosh. The father of bass fishing knows who I am. I couldn't believe it. I said, well, yeah. He said, oh, my gosh. He said, I get your magazine. I just love it. Well, I went back and looked at the database later, and the book was in his secretary's name. So I didn't know he was getting it. I should have known, but I didn't. But he says, I just love your magazine. I can't wait for it to come every issue. He said, I read it cover to cover. He said, don't you have a book out? And I said, yes, sir, I do. He says, well, how much is it? And I said, $20. So he gave me my $20 bill back. He says, go get one. Bring it here. And I want you to sign yours. I'll sign mine. And you sit here and let's talk for a minute. So I went and got that book, brought it back, signed it for him, gave it to him. He gave me his, and we chit-chatted for a while. And I could not wait to ask him. So I said, the first thing I asked him was, Ray, do you tell me what you really think about catch and release? Because he's the father of catch and release and bass tournaments, because he saw the harm it was doing to the fishery and to the fish. And people were, they didn't like people bringing in all those big fish, and they die, get cleaned or whatever. So I knew he was a big proponent of catch and release. So I said, tell me what you think about catch and release. What do you really think? He said, for public lakes with that much pressure, absolutely. It needs to be catch and release. Those fish need to be released to keep growing and getting bigger and not be taken out of the public lakes. He said, but my lake, the President's Lake down there in Petlal, Alabama, he says, we're going to take out every bass under 14 inches we can catch. And when I think we've taken enough, we're going to double it and take that many more. Well, I knew at that point I was going to like this guy. He said, his closing comment, he says, hey, are you ever going to come to Alabama? He said, if you do, I'd like you to come by my office and let's sit down and talk. So I said, you know what? I want to do that. So I got with Mark McDonald and I said, you know what? We need to do a little tour of the United States and let's go meet Pond Boss subscribers and let's get some stories for the magazine and let's swing by and see Ray. So Mark didn't get to go on that trip, but I did. And I took that trip, met up with him, went to his office, and the thing that struck me first was there was a sign right behind his head on his wall that says, if it ain't fun, we don't do it. And now I live by that. If it ain't fun, I'm not going to do it. And that came from Ray Scott. Now, I've got all kinds of cool stories about Ray Scott, and I'll share those as time goes by and tell you these are stories, personal stories I've had with him. I've been able to work on a project in upstate New York, went fishing with him in Canada several times. He took me to his favorite place in the entire world to go bass fishing outside of Hermosillo, Mexico. That was a great week worth of fun times. We've worked on projects in Georgia and Alabama and Texas. So I've got a pretty good history with Ray Scott and considered he to be a dear friend. He died at 88. He'd been, his memory was fading and he was frustrated with that. And I have peace to know that he's in heaven. And I'm so glad to have called him my friend. When he turned 75 years old, he called me. He says, hey, Pond Boss, he says, why don't you and the Queen come spend my 75th birthday with me and Susan? I said, Ray, I would be honored to do that. So we flew to New Orleans, Louisiana, and met up with Ray and Susan. We spent 2 fantastic days just roaming around New Orleans, Louisiana with Ray and Susan Scott to celebrate his 75th birthday. So I consider him a very dear friend, and I'm going to miss our talks, but I'm going to cherish those memories. So there's a little bit about Ray Scott and the Pond Boss hanging out. Let me see who all we got going on here. I see, holy cow, we've had a lot of folks check in. Good deal. My little phone's moving around here. Tom Davis, Todd Austin, I think I said hello to Tom. John Melig, Billy Bates checking in from Maryland. Walter Vaughn, good to see Walter. Chris Ketchum from Bells, Texas. Jacob West from Denison, Texas. Let's see here. There's Steve Scanlon. Good to see Steve. Leah DeStefano. Good to see Leah. Let's see. Danny Mack. Yep. I love sharing memories especially with people that I've gotten to know. And Ray Scott, man, he's one of those guys. He's just a fantastic guy. Let's talk about the myths of largemouth bass. Somewhere online, you can find a speech that I gave for bassresource.com on a field trip to Kentucky Lake. They had each year they try to do a little, kind of like a reunion. And bassresource.com, man, that's a great resource if you're a bass angler. All kinds of categories, good discussion forums, things like that. There's Ron Ardoin. Good to see Ron. So, and Billy Miller, I see Billy checking in. So, anyway, they asked me to give a speech on the myths of bass, the myths of largemouth bass. Well, I did that, and it ended up being something people liked. So you might want to dig that up and compare and contrast to what I'm going to say here. But I'm going to talk a little bit about some of those myths. Now, If you've got a question about largemouth bass, throw it at me and let's talk about it. I'm happy to discuss it. And I'm going to start off by saying, this is how I started that speech. I don't remember all the myths I talked about at that speech, but I remember how I started it off because I was addressing a room full of bass anglers. Now, I'll just wave my hand across it. Everybody in here, I promise you, everybody in here can outfish me. You guys are way better anglers than me, and that still holds true. I love to fish, but what I told them was, you can go catch those big fish, but you're not going to beat me at raising those fish that you're catching. That's what I do. It's a big part of what I do. Hello, Harrison Davis and Dwight Lee. Good to see you guys. So that's how I started that. And one of the things that I think is a myth about largemouth bass is people think that just because you can put the best bass habitat in there and then buy the best bass with the best genetics, that's an automatic ticket to grow a double-digit fish. And that's absolutely not true. Hello, Mark Dauber. Good to see you, buddy. Mark Dauber is from outside of Pensacola, Alabama. He is one of Ray Scott's neighbors and a great friend to Ray Scott. So, Mark, I'm so glad to see you. The first few minutes of this show, I talked about Ray and how we met and some things that we got to do together. I'm going to share some more stories as time goes on. I may not do it today, but I'll do it as time goes by because those memories with Ray and the things that I got to do with him are pretty special. Yep. So Justin Lugwood says it takes a special bass to reach double digits. Well, here's the way that works. And this is what I tell people when I'm on a pond site and we're designing a fishing lake. I'll say, you know what? Everybody thinks you just get the best genetics, make sure they got food, money whip it with bass, minnow, or with bait fish or whatever, and you're going to grow giant fish. That isn't how it works. It doesn't work that way. The Texas state record largemouth bass, 18.18 pounds. That record has now stood for over 30 years. And that was caught in Lake Fork in 1992, in February of 1992. Well, why is that? I mean, if a lake is going to produce a state record bass, don't you think it should be Lake Fork? So it's not just about genetics. It's about opportunity. So look at it this way. Let's say I know we got a lot of dog lovers out there. Sharmus Blake, good to see Sharmus. Haven't seen you before. Glad you're on here. Paul Clark, good to see you. Let's look at it this way. Let's say you're shopping for a good hunting dog and you want to buy a golden retriever. It's a black lab. So you get in touch with the best AKC breeder you can find, wherever that person is, and you start talking to them. And they have a female pregnant, getting ready to have a litter. She has 8 puppies. Now, realistically, how many of those puppies do you think, just because they're genetically there, will have what it takes to be a world champion? Well, people that know dogs, every time I ask somebody like that a question, they say none of them. None of them. Well, if the genetics is the big deal, then there's got to be some of them. But even if in that litter of 8 puppies, there's something with one of those that can be a champion, you can pretty well bet that there's going to be another one at the opposite end of that spectrum that might be a good family pet, but it is not going to be that championship hunting dog. Or it couldn't win a trial if it wanted to, no matter how much training. So genetics does play a role. Without Florida genetics, you're not going to grow a giant largemouth bass. But just because the fish has Florida genetics doesn't mean that it's got everything else that it's going to take to grow big. Now, what that means to me is it's got to have the genetic propensity, which means it's got to have the temperament, an aggressive nature, and it's got to have the opportunity and be a female. Now, if it's got all those things, that still doesn't guarantee it's even going to get a shot at double digits. Because, and we'll talk about the opportunity here in just a minute, but it's got to not get eaten. So, once you stock those first bass into that lake, those are going to be the fish that have the very, very best chance to grow huge. And when they start having babies, there's absolutely no assurance at all that any of their young of the year will have everything it takes and the opportunity to hit double digits. So think about that. Let's say you take let's say there's a female bass that lays 50,000 eggs. We can throw 25,000 of those in the trash because they're males. And of that other 25,000, there's about maybe 20% that have the genetics propensity, that has the aggressive nature, if they get the opportunity. Now, there's another thing about fish management called plasticity. You've heard me talk about that before. Plasticity is basically how a fish adjusts to that circumstance, in that environment, in that water, in that habitat, to that food chain. So that fish in this environment might not make it in that environment. So if they can grow up in this environment and have the opportunity, now the opportunity, what that means is if a fish misses a meal for more than 5 or 6 days in a row, they can't make that up. Now a bass can eat and then miss a couple of days and eat again and not lose weight because of that. But it's not going to hit a state record level if it doesn't have all the food it needs at every stage of its life in water that's not stressful water, with habitat that it can train to, that it can instinctively be attracted to and thrive in. You know, kind of like, it's also like Pavlov's dogs. It's got to be conditioned to that. And once those fish are conditioned to that and they've got all the food they need. Now think about, here's where it gets complicated. Bluegill spawn in the South 4 or 5 times a year. In the Midwest, 2 or 3 times a year. In northern waters, once or twice. So the food chain is different in northern waters than Midwest waters than southern waters. So when the fish are spawning, that food chain tends to ebb and flow. So if you're going to be a good lake manager, a good fisheries manager, and one of your missions is to try to grow double-digit fish, you've got to figure out how to provide the opportunity for those fish to have all the food they need whenever they need it. And you got to control and manage the competition amongst the species. So when the bass begin to reproduce in year 3 or 4, or sometimes in year 2, you're going to have a whole lot of fish that aren't going to make the grade, that are out there fighting for space and food against the fish that have that opportunity. That's where it gets complicated. So that's one of the myths about largemouth bass. So let's see here. Uh-oh, we got some flirting going on. Beth Martell and James Allen are talking to each other. That's pretty freaking cool. You kids. Hey, it's already 6:53. I can't believe that. So ask me a few questions about bass. Other myths about largemouth bass is that they're smart. They're not smart. They can't think. They don't have the pieces of the brain that a fish or that a human has to allow us to logically move through our lives and cognitively make decisions. A bass doesn't look up from where it is and say, you know what, that's a carp, I'm not going to eat it, I'm going to wait for a bluegill. If that fish is hungry, it's going to go eat it, whatever it can get. There's no discernment there other than keeping from being eaten. And a big bass doesn't have to worry about that. You know, so one of the myths is about how they behave and how they feed. You know, bass prefer to be ambush feeders, but they're not totally considered ambush feeders. I got to be involved in a project from a distance. Hello, Michael Gray, Troy Todd. Let's see who else we got here. Steve Scanlon. Did I hear you right that bass don't spawn in the first year being stocked? That's correct. I'll hit on that here in a minute. So I got to be involved from a distance on a project where 140 largemouth bass were radio tagged. And this was in a 125 acre lake. So 40 fish radio tagged. A guy working on his PhD tracked those fish's movements, followed them for about 18 months. And what he found out was that there were a couple, and all these fish were over 2 pounds. There was one bass that was a long and lean 7-pounder. And so we were trying to have to make decisions on, is it the food chain that's causing that fish to be long and lean? Well, come to find out, that fish moved 2 miles every day in a 125 acre lake. And it never moved in the same pathway. Never. It didn't go I kind of thought it would have run a trap line. You know, go over here. Is there food? No. Go over here. Food? No. Over here. Food? No. but it was really erratic in its movement. There were a couple other fish in that study that never left an area any bigger than a football field. So bass behavior can also play a role in how big they get and how they act. So this actually was a long, narrow lake, so it made sense that some of the fish conditioned to that lake to where they would move a lot, but there was just enough habitat in certain areas that there was going to be some fish that were going to be couch potatoes, and they were bigger, deeper, heavier bass because they didn't move as much. They didn't expend as much energy to go find food. So Steve says, did I hear you right that bass don't spawn in the first year of being stocked? That's right. Now, I'm not going to tell you it's never happened, but a bass has got to be about 9 or 10 inches long before it begins to mature sexually. So it usually takes a year for them to get big enough to become sexually mature, before they can even think about spawning. So that's not to say there won't be a few individuals that just blow up fast and grow huge that can spawn, but you don't start seeing reproduction that becomes problematic, I'll call it, until year 3. Because by that time, there's enough fish that have grown to sexual maturity that can reproduce enough to influence the whole population of fish. So there's the answer to that. Harrison Davis, how would a population of eels in a 3-acre largemouth bass pond impact the fishery? Well, those bass will eat the eels. Now the thing is eels need moving water to be able to reproduce. So if there's moving water and they can reproduce, eels would be a great source of food, albeit they're not an abundant source of food. I've worked on some lakes. Matter of fact, one lake in particular, Richmond Mill Lake up in North Carolina, that where every time we'd electrofish, we'd find American eels. And those things had to be years old because they were caught behind the dam in the lake. And they had to have come from upstream because they migrate there. They didn't reproduce there. So a population of eels in a 3-acre largemouth bass bluegill pond is not really going to impact the fishery. The bass are probably going to eat them. There's Richard Williams. The biggest bass I have caught are in ambush scenarios. So let's talk about that. So even though largemouth bass are considered ambush predators, that's their preferred way to eat. So when I'm designing a bass lake, one of the first things I look at is how much shoreline do we have? How much shallow water do we have? And most lake sites have too much shallow water in my experience. So one of the things I talked to that landowner about is let's figure out where the dirt's going to come from to build the dam, and then let's figure out where the water's going to be shallow, and let's create more shoreline. And we do that by creating peninsulas or islands or humps or something like that. So what largemouth bass love is they love the end of a point, shallow water with quick access to deep water besides some structure. In that case, what I like to do is design, like water from 0 to 3, then a shelf at 3 feet deep. Put gravel on that shelf. Try to coax bluegills to spawn there. And then we'll run the trunk of a tree with some canopy on it at a 45-degree angle running right across the side of that spawning bed, that gravel bed, going down to water 8, 10, 12 feet deep, sometimes deeper depending on how deep the lake is. So that's what we try to figure out, because I know that if we've got those circumstances, that bass that wants to dominate that zone is going to do it and not have to leave there because some fish are going to come by that it can eat. So we create ambush points. Dennis Smith, will bass spawn in only certain depths? It depends on that lake. I came across a bass nest one time in water 15 feet deep on top of a stump that was 8 feet underwater, and it was crystal clear and you could see it. Bass for the most part prefer to spawn in water 3 to 6 feet deep on gravel, but if there's a firm substrate somewhere, they're going to spawn on it anywhere from 3 to 6 feet deep typically. And it just depends on the lake. So there you go. Troy Todd, typically how many pounds of largemouth bass can a pond support per acre in a non-aerated pond? I'm going to tell you a typical pond can support somewhere between 50 and 75 pounds of bass per acre. Now, if you think about that, it doesn't sound like a lot, which it's not. 50 pounds of bass in an area the size of a football field is not nearly as many as what carp do or what channel catfish can do or even what sunfish can do. But when you start thinking about their hierarchy, where they sit on the food chain, they're way up at the top, you know. And so the way that works is it takes 10 pounds of bait fish for a bass to gain a pound. It takes 10 pounds of food for the bait fish to gain a pound. It takes 10 pounds of other food for the food to gain a pound. So by the time you look at this food pyramid, you get all the way to the top, there's so much energy conversion and so much conversion going on of the natural food chain, all it can really support is 50, 75 pounds of bass. Now, whether it's 50 or 75 depends on how you're managing the lake. And I do have some lakes where they push it beyond that, but they're going to some extraordinary effort to get that done. You know, like feed train largemouth bass, or a strong feeding program for bluegills, you know, or bumping it up with 1,000 pounds of crawfish in a 6-acre lake twice a year, or rainbow trout, or adding golden shiners, or money whipping it to do that. So 50 to 75 pounds per acre is pretty typical. I'm going to take a pause here. Hey, Pond Boss Magazine, $35 a year. There it is. Cheaper than a Friday night date. Lasts a year. And there's nuggets in every issue. The May, June is in the mail. I don't know if anybody's got it yet, but you should have it pretty quick. Let's see. This one is the March, April. I had a May, June in here, but I think Debbie gave it to an electrical contractor today as we're working on this house to get it finished. Also want to thank Purina Mills for their sponsorship of this show and sponsorship of Pond Boss just as a whole. I've been able to work with Purina Mills since 1995, and they earnestly create the best products they can with the best ingredients, and I think that makes a big difference to me. You know, I endorse them. I love their feeds. I've seen what the feeds do. I've grown some huge fish on Purina Fish Foods. Texas Hunter, got to correspond with Chris Blood today a little bit. I had a guy wanted to buy a feeder, and I emailed Chris so he could ship it out. Had him order one yesterday, and that guy got his feeder today. I'd forgotten to order the guy's feeder. He texted me, he says, "Hey, is my feeder coming?" I thought, oh crap, I forgot. So I sent Chris an email yesterday about 10 o'clock in the morning. That feeder went out at 2 o'clock yesterday afternoon, and it showed up at the guy's place by noon today. That's customer service right there, and I really appreciate that. You know, Easy Docks of Texas, David Schneiderman, glad that he's a sponsor of this show. So you know what? We also have a resource guide, Pond Boss Resource Guide. Now that if you buy a subscription to the magazine, you get a copy of this resource guide. Now, the thing there is, it's also online. So you can go to pondboss.com and click on the heading resource guide, and you can get the same thing there for free. You know, which you can get this resource guide for free anyway. If you just send us a note, you want one, we'll send it to you. I'll get Leanne to ship one to you with a copy of the magazine so you can see what we got going on. Pondboss.com, free articles. We link every one of these shows. After this show, Leanne will upload it to YouTube and then link to the YouTube video from the Pond Boss website. Ask the Boss Forum. Great resource for you if you want to interact with real people that know what they're doing. Go there. That's good. That's a good resource. We have a lot of guys on there that know what they're talking about. So you have a whole lot of resources out there through Pond Boss that can help you. I'm a little distracted today. I got several things on my mind. Ray Scott being one of them. Okay, let's see. Greg Russell, fishing and listening to the Pond Boss. What could be better trying to learn? Okay, I don't know what you're throwing out there today there. So, Greg, you know, Bill Dance used to tell me, Bill Dance told me one time I was at his office, and just a couple of short stories about Bill. He said, "Hey, I got a question for you." He says, "When you're designing a lake," he said, "what do you do in the middle of the lake?" And I said, "I avoid the middle of the lake." He says, "Why?" I said, "Because in these smaller private lakes, when the water stratifies in the summertime, the fish, they go deep, and you can't put enough structure in there to come up above the thermocline to really make a difference. So I've learned to focus on the littoral zone, which is primarily water 8 feet deep and shallower around the perimeter of the lake." He said, "Well, when I go fishing," he said, "first thing I look for is I try the shoreline, but if it's in the summer and they're in a summer pattern, I'm going to go out in that lake and I'm going to try to find underwater humps that come up above that thermocline, and then I'm going to start fan casting around that hump." And then after I do that, if they're not picking up the baits that I'm throwing, he said, I'm going to change colors, or I'm going to change a little bit of technique, or I'm going to change lures. He said, but once I find those fish and then I can pattern them, then we can start catching fish. So I took that lesson home. And so now there are times that if the site is conducive to it, I'll start adding some bottom structure in deeper water, as long as I know that it's going to come up above where the thermocline is going to be. The second thing he says, Bob, I've got a lake over here west of Memphis, and I shoot some shows on it. He says, and he says, my trophy bass numbers are going down. And I said, well, okay, which to me, that's normal. So I said, tell me what's your methods? He says, well, early on, he said, after about the third year, we started calling bass that were under 14 inches. He said, then my biologist said, let's start culling bass 16 inches. He says, now we're culling bass 4 pounds and smaller. I said, that's the problem. He said, well, what do you mean? I said, is a 4-pound bass a boy or a girl? He said, it's a girl. I said, are your double-digit bass boys or girls? He said, they're all girls. So I said, you're culling your junior varsity. I said, let me tell you, I did not learn this at Texas A&M University when I was in college. I had to figure this out by myself. Now listen to me, Bill. I said, a 4-pound bass cannot grow to 8 pounds in a skillet. So he started laughing. He said, oh, I love that. Can I use that? I said, sure you can. So at that point, he started preserving those fish that are on the junior varsity to at least give them the opportunity. If a fish makes it to 4 pounds, it's finally made the size that it can turn around and eat smaller bass in that lake. So preserve those fish. Make you take them out. If a 4-pound bass, if it's like 18 and a half or 19 inches long and looks like a football, throw it back. If it's 22 inches long and weighs 4 pounds, then you probably should consider taking it out because it's geriatric or something's wrong with it and it ain't going to grow. Harrison Davis, sounds like having that extra different food source of eel meat could improve bass growth. Yeah, it can. Although I don't know, when you say a population of eels, to me, that means there's a few. It doesn't mean it's significant, but bass are going to eat an eel if they can catch it. Of course, they're slippery. I don't know if you've ever tried to hold one, but they're slippery. Leah Groons, good to see Leah from up around the Tulsa, Oklahoma area. Michael Ehrig, I called Texas Under Monday to order a replacement feeder lid. Came home after work today, and here it made it to Iowa fast. That's right. All right, James Allen, since the last class, I measured happy water at 2 p.m. Dissolved oxygen is 9 parts per million, which that's pretty high. Temperature 68, that's great. Conductivity is 330 microohms. Alkalinity is 130 to 140. pH is 7.9, but the turbidity is 40 inches, the clearest ever. Is that low on algae? Yes, it is. That is low on algae for water that temperature for this time of year. Although that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you're feeding the fish, it's okay to have water clear like that. But there's probably another reason that water is clear, and it may have to do with these back-to-back fronts or heavy rains or something like that. But it could also be low fertility there in Kentucky. Let's see, Justin Ludwig, lots of good discussion on the benefits of higher protein fish food on the forum lately. Yes, I got involved in that a little bit. Started reading some things on there that I thought I could offer up some of my experience. So there you go. I got a text from Trey Carpenter, who's watching this show tonight. Trey's a retired wildlife biologist that's heavy into wildlife management and fishes a lot and is doing some lake management down in the Texas Hill Country. And one of the take-home points he's gotten from the discussion about fish food is ingredients. One of the things that I look at when I'm talking to people about fish foods is what are the ingredients? Is it fish meal? What kind of fish meal? Is it menhaden meal or is it something else? Is it offals coming out of a processing plant? What is it? Usually it's fish meal. When you read the tag and it tells you what the ingredients are, it doesn't necessarily tell you the percentage. So there's a lot of things out there. There's some feed companies that make their feeds, fish food included, out of least cost. So the protein may be right, but if soybean meal is cheaper than wheat middlings or whatever, they're going to go with the cheapest ingredients so their price point will be down, even though it'll still meet the tag. But the best ingredients in fish food are what that species of fish needs nutritionally. And that's one thing I know that I can trust with Purina Mills, is their ingredients go into a recipe that's designed for the nutrition for bluegill sunfish, hybrid stripers, largemouth bass, and the other lineup of feeds such as, for tilapia or, channel catfish or whatever you're feeding. So that's one of the things that makes me stay faithful and loyal with Purina Mills, is their ingredients and the way that they formulate their recipes, their vitamin packages. They're striving to have the best nutritional needs met for that species of animal. Mike Fornash, hello Sonny Mitchell, good to see you. Mike says, do you have any suggestions on how to keep grass carp from eating fish food at feeding time? Shoot them. I see that pretty often, believe it or not. But what grass carp do is, if they can come and eat a cheap meal and not have to go make a living, they'll do it. But here's the caveat to that, is that feeder goes off, once a day for 10 seconds or 3 times a day for 20 seconds or whatever. But there's 23 hours and 59 minutes that feeder's not going off. And those grass carp should be out there making a living doing what they do. Now, one thing that I have done in the past is sometimes you can change the timer on that feeder and set it to go off like 2 in the morning for a few weeks and completely change the behavior patterns of all the fish. And the grass carp don't seem to be quite as adaptive to coming up and eating at night, although they will. And of course, if you're going to stay up and watch fish eat at 2 in the morning, how do you know what's out there? But I have done that, and I think with some limited results, because do that for 2 or 3 weeks and then switch it back to the time you want. Then I have seen fewer grass carp for short-term success trying to keep the grass carp from eating your fish food. Okay, so Jim Allen, our lake has a lot of springs and we can see it on sonar. Wouldn't that break up thermoclines and a good place to put habitat? Tell you how I'm going to answer that. That's a great big maybe. Now, what I mean by that maybe is the thermocline is made up of warm water sitting on top of cold water. Most springs, come into the water cool with 0 oxygen. So unless that water is a temperature that can cause it to rise and come up and go through the thermocline, it isn't going to do it. So one thing when you're looking on your sonar, look at your side scan or your live scope, if you have one of those, and see, are there fish there? And if their fish are there, which I'd be surprised if they were, then I'd enhance it with some habitat. But if you look around there and there's no fish there and they're somewhere else, go enhance that habitat. It's kind of the way I see it. Let's see Patrick Clayton checking in. I got a text from Patrick as I was getting ready for this show. He's been checking temperatures in the river behind us. Sonny Mitchell, I've been fertilizing my 5-acre lake for years and noticed a decreased fish bite temporarily after I get a bloom. Everybody seems to deny this happens. What is your experience with this? It makes sense. It makes sense that you get a temporary decrease in fish bite. Now the reason is you've just altered the water chemistry slightly. You changed the visibility of the water measurably, and the fish can't see to eat. So now they've got to readjust and figure out how they can make a living in that water. So I have seen lakes, and it's not that uncommon, where after you fertilize, 3 or 4 days after the bloom starts to really kick in, for about 5 or 6 days after that, the fish are going through an adjustment, especially with visibility. Because if they can see 10 feet, that's different than being able to see 18 inches or 24 inches. So they have to adjust their behavior, and and be attracted to sound more so than vision. So that's how I see that. But it is temporary, because what happens then is the food chain is bolstered by the fertility, by the plankton bloom that now is going to feed a bunch of insects. So another one of the reasons that the bite slows down is the food chain changes. When your lake gets fertile, you're adding to the food chain at a lower level, which is going to create more food at the higher levels. And that happens fairly quickly. Once you get a bloom going, it doesn't take 5 or 6 days before that food chain begins to convert the energy that it's now got, that it can eat. Okay, let me see what else we got here. Dwight Lee, if you're culling bass of a particular size, is it preferable to cull one sex over another? Yes, it is. You want to, if you're culling bass, it's preferable to cull more males if you can tell the difference. Now, if you can't, one of the things I tell folks is weigh and measure the fish. Now, one of the myths about largemouth bass is that they stunt. They don't stunt. What happens is their growth rates can slow down, but if they get the opportunity to continue growing with more food, they will. But what they can't do is they can't make up for what they lost when they didn't have enough food. So in other words, a 14-inch bass, to get to 14 inches, has got to weigh 1 pound, 7 ounces. If you catch a 14-inch bass that weighs 1 pound and 1 ounce, it lost weight. And that's either because it just laid a bunch of eggs, or it doesn't have enough food, or both. And that being the case, then you got to make a judgment call. So I like to weigh and measure the fish and compare them to standard. And as long as a bass is above about 92% relative weight, I'm a lot more opposed to culling it. But if it's 85, 86, I'm likely to want to cull it, whether it's a boy or a girl. Because once it gets down to 85%, it's going to have a hard time making up that ground and reaching whatever its genetic potential would have been. You know, so bottom line is this: the longer a certain size class of fish goes without food, the less likely they are to reach their potential sizes. Now, that doesn't mean you can't grow some big fish from that batch of fish, even though they were neglected for a year, not culled like they should have been. You know, but it's pretty smart to look at their relative weights. And if their body condition is good, if you catch a 13-inch female bass that looks like what Ray Scott used to say, looked like an Alabama deputy sheriff, throw it back. You know, because that fish has figured out how to play the game in your lake, and it deserves a chance to get bigger. Okay, JP, Patrick Clayton says, do bass tend to travel along contour lines? You know what? They do. They do travel along contour lines at that depth based on the temperature of the water. Largemouth bass like to move around and find the water temperature that best suits them. Water temperature is more important to a largemouth bass than the amount of oxygen in that water. As long as they've got enough oxygen that they don't suffocate, they're going to move there. And if that contour line water temperature is perfect, you bet they'll move along that contour line. Now that doesn't mean that they're going to stay there. You know, if they're hungry and it's a 13-inch bass and it's cruising with 5 or 6 others at 8 feet deep along a contour line around a point, and they detect movement of a school of threadfin shad 30 feet away, 5 feet above them, they're going to go investigate that, and they're going to do the best they can to feed. And after they feed, they may go right back down to that same contour line. So they do have a tendency to travel along contour lines when they're on the move. You know, now, they're not always on the move. But the answer to your question is, yes, they do tend to travel along contour lines. James Allen, old Jim, got his first bag of Purina largemouth bass food with my photo on it. Hey, I didn't have anything to do with that. My wife did that. Back when Purina was kind of revamping the Aquamax lineup of fish foods, they came to our house and they wanted to talk about me writing the instructions for the back of the feed bag. So we were all around the kitchen table. I think there were 4 of us, and we were talking about the instructions that they wanted. They wanted me to write it, and Debbie's listening it in. So she comes and leans over the table and she says, boys, if he's going to write the instructions on that back of the bag for you guys, I want his picture back there. So those guys, one of them said, well, I don't know if we can do that. Debbie said, you can do it. You're here making decisions. And they looked at each other, and one said, we can probably do that. Debbie said, listen to me. Put his picture on the back of that bag because he's the one writing the instructions, and give credit to Pond Boss. So that's my queen. So that's the reason my picture's on the bag of Aquamax fish food bags. Everybody else's pictures at the post office. Mine's on a bag of fish food. Patrick, condolences for the loss of my friend Ray Scott. You were telling me about him just the other day. Yep, that's right. Thank you for that. Appreciate it. All right, so let's see here. Justin Ludwig. Let's see what else we got. I'm getting a little bit behind here. 14 inches and under because they're usually male. Yeah, depends on the age of that fishery, Justin. If that fishery is 3 years old and it's time to start culling, you can bet there's going to be a lot of 14-inch females as well. But if that fishery is, say, 6 or 7 years old, odds are high that the percentages of bass 14 inches and smaller are going to be more male related. So that is true. Now, one of the things you do is you're judging that fishery. If you catch a 16-inch bass and you know it's a male, are you going to take it out? Because males don't typically get much bigger than a pound to a pound and a half. I've never seen a male bigger than 4 pounds. I heard about a double-digit male at the Athens Fish Hatchery in Texas. I can't wait to call Tom Lang and ask him about that. Because I've never seen that. I've seen male bass 4 pounds, and those are rare, really rare. But most of those, and if I find a 4-pound male and I know it's a male, it's going back in that lake because it's got the genetics to be huge, or it wouldn't be 4 pounds as a male. So how can you tell the difference? Doug Cusick says, how can you tell the difference between male and female fish of any species besides the size of their belly? You spread their little fins and look. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Well, like a largemouth bass, if you take you could take like a toothpick, for example, and down there around its anus, if you take that toothpick and you just go from the back of the fish toward the front and run it over the vent, if it just hangs up a little bit, that's a male. But if it's a slit, it's a female. And I'll tell you this, there's guys like me that do this for a living that we can miss, 30% doing it that way. And we can even miss it by 30% even if we have a little pipette and we stick it in there and try to pull some eggs out, because once they're post-spawn, you don't know. So there's not an easy way to check. Now with some of the other fish like bluegills, the males turn dark, their scales are tipped in black, and the females are lighter colored and their scales are not tipped in black. Red ear sunfish, the males are dark, the females are not, they're lighter. So you can look at the colors of sunfish and be able to tell them, but not so much with largemouth bass. So Patrick says, any evidence of bass eating young common carp or buffalo? Absolutely, absolutely. I've shocked them up in like old gravel pit lakes adjacent to the Trinity River and have them regurgitate stuff that I never dreamed that they would even think about eating. But in my live well, I've seen everything from water moccasins come out of the belly of a bass to frogs and turtles to small carp and even, lots of bass. They eat a lot of bass. But they'll eat anything that fits in their mouth that's moving for the most part. So it doesn't matter. They don't care if it's a buffalo or a rainbow trout. If it fits in their mouth and they're hungry, they're going to eat it. Sometimes they don't even have to be hungry. I have caught a bass before on a spinnerbait that had it's like a 6-pound bass, a big bass, had a 1.5 pound bass sticking out of its gullet. The tail was sticking out about that far, and it hit a lure. Greedy little squirt. Patrick saying, thoughts on live sonar and offshore fish populations. Going to have an impact on our fisheries, some incredible fish being caught. It's all about harvest. The means, the methods, that's all going to be subject for debate. I mean, is it okay to fish with an Alabama rig, an umbrella rig? Can you do that? You might catch 5 fish at a time. What's that going to do to the population? That's why, as we're managing our fisheries, it's incumbent on us to keep track of what we're catching. Because that's going to tell us. That's going to tell us if we're over-harvesting or under-harvesting. If the fish are gaining weight, leave them alone. If they're losing weight, harvest some, cull some, let the food chain catch back up. So I I don't know about live sonar and offshore fish populations. I do know this, that if those anglers are reporting their catches to the decision makers, like Greg Stuns and guys like that in the Gulf of Mexico, then he can make good recommendations to the agencies that regulate that. So just because you can see it on live sonar and increase your catch rates doesn't mean that's a bad thing. What makes it a bad thing is if you can determine that resource is being over-harvested, which is the same thing you want to do with your private ponds and lakes. You want to check and make sure that your fish are harvested properly. And the way that you do that is you observe the fish, weigh and measure some, and then figure that out as you go. Okay, Stephen Martin, what characteristics do you look for when trying to sex a bass? I really like to do that in January and February with an electrofishing boat. But you don't have an electrofishing boat. So the characteristics that I'm looking for trying to sex a bass, I want to look at the stomach, which is not always a dead giveaway, because if a big male bass just ate a 3/4 pound gizzard shad, its belly's going to be sticking out and bulging. But you can look at the belly of the bass, and if it's bilaterally symmetrical, the same on both sides, and you can see that there's ovaries, then you can tell. During the spawn, you can catch a male, turn it upside down, run your fingers along its underbelly, and you'll see milk come out. It's white sperm coming out of the fish. So the characteristics that I'm looking for are those external characteristics. Now, if I'm going to get really serious about it in the springtime, I'm going to get a little pipette and put it in the vent, see if I can pull some eggs out. And if I can, and I'm positive, then I'll make that decision what to do with that fish at that point. But the characteristics I'm looking for, I don't even try to sex a bass in July. I'm not going to do it. Sometimes you can catch a male, it's all worn out, you can see it's thin, lanky, and tell that it's a male, but then you go to clean it, and it's got ovaries. So who knows? There's not an easy way to do that. Billy Miller, this spring my whole pond is all muddy, turbid water. Normally it's used to have a lot of aquatic plants, and I more or less nuked it and have almost zero aquatic plants. Couldn't that be affecting why my water is muddy this spring? In the winter it was clear. Absolutely right, it could. Absolutely right. One of the things I tell folks all the time when I'm giving seminars and even face-to-face is think about the decisions you're about to make. You're going to feed the fish? If you're going to feed the fish, what are the consequences of feeding the fish? If you're going to take out some aquatic plants, what are the consequences of taking out those plants? And in this case, it sure could be. I'm not going to tell you that's the cause, but it sure could play a role. Let's see here. There's the hammer. Caught several 5 to 6 pound males on Ivy this year. I totally believe that. I do. I totally believe you can catch some 5 to 6 pound bass males on OH-Ivy Lake. That lake has got what I call the new lake syndrome going on. So that lake went completely dry, filled back up 6 or 7 years ago. I don't remember when it was, probably 2015 when we had the floods. But it went all the way dry. New habitat grew up in the basin of the lake. It filled up. They stocked it properly. And now you're seeing the best of the best thriving in that lake. And I think either that lake or the one where we met up there, Allen Henry, I think that's the name of that lake. One of those lakes out there is going to be, if the state record is broken, it's going to be from one of those lakes that has gone through that process. So I totally believe that you have caught some fish that big, some males that big. I see Bonnie Harrington Trombetta. Good to see you checking in. Let's see here. I think we're just about out of questions. So it's 7:30. I'm going to start wrapping it up. Hey, don't forget, Palm Boss Magazine, $35 a year. Here we go. Do it to it. I see Fred Bingaman checking in. So, hey, I really appreciate you guys watching this show. This hour always seems to go by fast. You guys keep energizing me with your questions, and I do appreciate it. And so, not sure where I'll be next Wednesday, but I know this. I'm going to be hanging out with you. So until next Wednesday, adios.